African leaders have taken a stand against corruption in the continent, and the target to end the scourge in this year 2018, and Nigeria is leading the fight against the fight through Economic and Financial Crimes Commission and President Muhammadu Buhari's zeal to see that corruption is wiped out of Nigeria.
Yes, indeed. And joining us from Abuja studio is Executive Secretary of the Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption, Professor Bolaji Owasonye. Good morning and thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me.
All right. It's interesting to note that African leaders seem to have woken up to the fight against corruption. But would you say that it is not more of lip service, really, than anything else?
Well, you're right that in some contexts and from some regions, the argument or the criticism that some leaders are not walking the talk will be very valid. However, Nigeria was chosen to lead this issue because there's a clear difference in President Buhari's resolve to challenge corruption, which has become an existential issue for Nigeria and indeed for Africa. Now, other African leaders have realized that this is the way to go, especially because a lot of the capital that is needed for development in Africa finds its way out of the continent due to a myriad of factors. And it is very clear that Africa may not meet the sustainable development goals and the development targets that have been set by the international community, and some that have been set by Africa itself, except it blocks loopholes, retain capital that is earned from Africa, but that is lost to corruption and other myriad factors. So that is the issue. So basically, African leaders are now focusing on implementing the Thabo Mbeki panel report, which they in fact commissioned in 2012. They are now determined to implement the major recommendations of the Thabo Mbeki panel, and then to look at effective measures through which money that had been lost can be recovered. And thirdly, how the recovered funds should be applied. So in summary, these are the major issues that are engaging our attention yesterday and today.
All right. Now, this summit is not the first that is being held on the issue of corruption. We remember the last one in Mauritius and all of that. Now, assessing all of this conferences and summits that heads of state have admitted that is warring the continent, how would you assess the implementation of the resolutions from these conferences and these summits on the various economies and the continent at large?
The truth of the matter is that African countries have not been faithful in implementing resolutions to deal with corruption. And the reasons for that are myriad. Some of the leaders in Africa are sit-tight leaders. Some of them have been in office longer than you and I can imagine. So the willingness and for being in office for that length of time, some of them are responsible for the challenges that are afflicting their country. So finding the will to implement measures that would indict them and would reverse the anomalies that they cause, some of them obviously do not have that zeal, I must say. On the other hand, there are examples of good practices, of determination that you can find in countries like Rwanda and Nigeria, and even efforts in Kenya and other countries. So clearly, and the third factor, which is even more realistic, is that if Africa does not take measures to stop the hemorrhage, capital hemorrhage, and the bleeding of resources that is happening within this continent, we are not going to be able to get the money that we need for development. Now, for some few years now, the international community has been discussing challenges around financing for development. Okay, fine. We have 16 major goals to meet in the SDG. Where is the money going to come from? To provide health, to provide education, deal with environmental challenges, improve governance and rule of law, equality, you know. These are major issues, and the money has to come from somewhere. Now, Africa cannot continue to look outside for the resources to make changes, when in fact everybody knows that it is such a blessed continent, but internal strife, conflict, misgovernance, and a myriad of challenges are responsible for our inability to effectively appropriate the resources that God has so generously given to us. So, in realization of this, the AU decided that 2018 will focus on corruption. And they unanimously selected President Buhari, given what were seen as his own successes. Because I must tell you that asset recovery and return is a major challenge globally. When you are fighting corruption, you have lost money to other countries. Even internally, to recover assets that have been lost is a major challenge. So even though Nigerians are not particularly, some Nigerians, I should say, particularly excited about Nigeria's anti-corruption effort, outside this country, people are very, very excited and impressed about what the president has been able to achieve, given the state of affairs that he inherited. So that is, we're looking at agreeing on global standards, uniform practices, diminishing illicit financial flows, implementing the Thabo Mbeki panel report, improving asset recovery, and also guiding about how recovered assets should be spent.
Okay, Professor Owasonye, like they say, prevention is better than the cure. I mean, when $50 billion flows out of Africa every year, and we're talking about, you know, recovery of assets, recovery of stolen funds and all of that, how about plugging those loopholes that actually, allow for corruption to thrive? And some people have even said, if you fix poverty, if you fix the infrastructure problem, if you fix all of those basic issues, then you fix corruption.
To a large extent, I agree, absolutely. Prevention is better than cure. And the truth of the matter is that pursuing lost assets is a very expensive venture and very, very frustrating. It is also demeaning to the integrity and the sovereignty of the nation, because in some situations, if you are trying to recover from outside the country, then the tie conditions to getting your own funds back. I mean, somebody who has facilitated or encouraged or is keeping assets that are stolen from your country will begin to tell you about how you should use the assets if they are returned to you. But I also agree with you that improving social indicators and improving the quality of life in Africa should help to diminish retail corruption in particular and improve livelihoods. However, with regard to the kind of corruption that Africa is facing, the people who steal the money are not poor people. They are simply people who are greedy. You are looking at politically exposed persons who steal the money. So the people who have been given opportunity and who have been put in a position of trust, so they are the ones who steal the money. So while I am not justifying poverty, and I agree with you that we need to improve social indicators, the welfare of African citizens, and what have you, I'm just trying to call your attention to the fact that the people who steal our money and allow us to be impoverished are not poor. Okay? They are poor in character, they are poor in integrity, they are poor in understanding. That's their poverty. They have a poverty of understanding. Because when you look at the amount of money sometimes stolen, okay, it's not money they can spend in a lifetime. But the other side of the equation is that a lot of the money that is lost by Africa is due to ignorance and the lack of capacity okay, to block the money from going out. I mean, talking about the prevention is better than cure that you mentioned. And the bulk of this is lost through what we call illicit financial flows. That's through commercial transactions that are seemingly legal on the surface of, you know, investment. But due to regulatory weaknesses, carelessness of regulators, the corruption of regulators, or compromise, money that should not leave Africa leaves Africa. Yeah. Africa is then also not able to collect taxes that are due from multinational corporations and even local companies. So when you say prevention is better than cure, one of the ways to affirm that is to improve regulatory oversight to make sure that we do not lose funds that we ought to retain within the continent.
All right. As at 2017, last year, Nigeria still ranked 148th out of 175 countries in the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International. And if other African countries, like you say, are quite impressed with what Nigeria is doing as to fighting corruption, I wonder why Nigeria is not moving up on the index scale.
Okay, very good question. Yeah. Interestingly, we just, some members of the committee, we were in some African countries. Mind you, the Transparency International Index, as you said, is a perception index. You ask a range of questions from some people, and they give you their perception oversight to make sure that we do not lose funds that we ought to retain within the continent.
All right. As at 2017, last year, Nigeria still ranked 148th out of 175 countries in the Corruption Perception Index by Transparency International. And if other African countries, like you say, are quite impressed with what Nigeria is doing as to fighting corruption, I wonder why Nigeria is not moving up on the index scale.
Okay, very good question. Yeah. Interestingly, we just, some members of the committee, we were in some African countries. Mind you, the Transparency International Index, as you said, is a perception index. You ask a range of questions from some people, and they give you their perception, okay? The perception may be very far from the reality, number one, and from the facts. Now, from this African country, which has a better rating, we were having this conversation about, fine, what are the issues with your institutions? We also would like to learn, because we are focused on institutional strengthening and sustaining this challenge against corruption beyond President Buhari's regime. And they said to us that with the Transparency International Perception Index and other indicators, in fact, they recognize that they have corruption challenges. But as far as they are concerned, it's a local problem. They are not supposed to wash their dirty linen in public. Therefore, when a foreign survey asks them questions about, for example, oh, do you have corruption in this sector? How do you deal with that? They simply underplay it. But Nigerians are very vocal people, very courageous. We speak our minds. So when something is going wrong, you focus on it and you say, look, this is not right. I think this is not working well, and so on. And that's the basis on which the rating is done. Now, I'm not saying,
are you saying that
there are no challenges in
Nigeria.
Are
you saying, in effect, that Nigeria is not as corrupt as we have been made to believe, both within Nigeria and, of course, outside the country, where we have even been described as fantastically corrupt?
Well, interestingly, let me start with the last comment. Interestingly, the Prime Minister of Britain, who described Nigeria as fantastically corrupt, is very hypocritical, because Britain is the headquarters of stolen funds. And they recognize that and are taking measures. But they know how to manage diplomatically, okay, their own weaknesses. But of course, we go to town on our problems, and it's good for us to confront our issues and to say we need to deal with them. Okay, what I'm saying is that sometimes we are very uncharitable to ourselves. We over-exaggerate our own problems, and then we give the impression that things are worse than they are. Oftentimes, when people come into the country, given a lot of the negative media that we receive, some people are scared. I'll give you one example. Some of the delegates who were coming for this conference said they wanted to fly straight into Abuja, that they would rather not fly into Lagos. And we said, why not? The most convenient flight to bring you from your country is to Lagos. All the things they read about Lagos. Lagos is this, Lagos is that. We said, when people are living in Lagos, we fly through Lagos and there's nothing wrong with Lagos. If you want to come and you want an easy ride, land in Lagos. And they did. And by their own testimony, that they were very surprised. All the things that they read is not justified and all that. So the point I'm trying to make is that perception can be stronger than reality. Sometimes we don't give any credit to ourselves about the things we have achieved. This does not mean we don't have problems. That does not mean there is no corruption. That does not mean transparency is 100% wrong. I'll give you another example. One of the questions that is asked in the Transparency Perception Index, in which Nigeria scored poorly, was a question like, for example, do we have budgetary processes? The answer to that is yes. And so you ask yourself, how would anybody respond to a question in a perception index that asks whether or not there are transparent laws about spending money?
All right, Professor.
We have transparent laws.
Yeah, Professor, let me ask you this before we go.
No spending goes on without...
sorry, we're trying to be mindful of time. Yes. The last dispensation, the former Minister of Finance, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, took her time with the government at that time to publish monthly the allocations to states and local government and how much government at all levels share, which a lot of Nigerians saw as being open and being transparent. Under this dispensation, Nigerians were expecting that that tempo would have been kept up, but it seemed not to be so. Why did the government stop that?
But you know that every month, and the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Finance can give you a much more broad response to this. But every month when they have the FAC meetings and there is any distribution or allocation, it is published. What states get and all that. I do agree with you that the government could go a step further by sustaining the publication of what states got, what local governments got, and all that. It's a good step. But much more importantly is, how do citizens use the information? So it takes me back to the cynicism that I talked about earlier on. Even when this was being published in full, people were not challenging their own governments to say, you got this much, how did you spend it? What are your priority projects?
All right.
And so on and so forth. So the point I'm making is that I agree with you, it's a good measure. Government still publishes and announces how much is shared every time that they meet, how much states get, and all that. The only missing link will be that local government by local government is not mentioned.
Okay,
but
Professor
the idea
Bolaji,
behind that publicity.
we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the show this morning. Professor Bolaji Owasonye is Executive Secretary, Presidential Advisory Committee Against Corruption, also known as PACAC. Thank you so much for joining us.